Hello, listeners. Been wondering how you can help the show? Probably not. But here are 5 things you can do. 1. Subscribe. Support the show by clicking the subscription link in the show notes. 2. Review on iTunes, on our website, www.afraidofnothingpodcast.com, or on whatever app you listen to. 3. Donate. When you go to our website, click the cute coffee cup icon. Or in the show notes, click the subscription link. 4. Share. Sharing really is caring. Tell your friends and even your enemies to check out the show. 5. Watch. Wait a minute, it's a podcast, not a movie. Actually, it's both. Check the show notes to find out where to watch the documentary. You can also rent it on Prime Video. That's it. Oh, one last thing. Enjoy this episode.
In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
Michelle Belanger is an author, occult expert, presenter, singer, and media personality. Featured on A&E's Paranormal State, Michelle is a gifted psychic as well as a skilled energy worker. Michelle has published over 24 books and is best known as an author for The Psychic Vampire Codex and The Dictionary of Demons. More recently, Michelle can be seen on Portals to Hell with host Jack Osborne and paranormal researcher Katrina Weidman. Michelle's work has taken her around the country and the globe, but she makes her home in Ohio, where she was born. You can learn more about what Michelle is up to at her website, michellebelanger.com, Michellebelanger.com. And you can gain access to books, classes, live streams, and more at Michelle's Patreon page, www.patreon.com/haunted. That's www.patreon.com/haunted. Welcome to the show, Michelle Belanger.
Hey, how you doing?
You know, I interviewed a guy who you probably know. His name is Jeff Belanger, and he always gets to, is he related to you? Have you guys ever met in real life?
We have met in real life. We may be related, but like many, many generations back. We're both Acadian French. So in the sense that we have shared descendants back a couple, several generations, there's that going on. But otherwise, yeah, some people think I'm his wife. We get asked regularly whether we're brother and sister. There is an interesting coincidence in the fact that we're both really into the paranormal and the supernatural. And the thing is in Acadian French, the last name is not that unusual. It's not quite as common as Smith or Jones, but it's not, super rare, especially in New England, where both of our families are from.
A lot of people know you from Paranormal State, but most recently you've been on Portals to Hell with Jack Osborne and Katrina Weidman. You mind telling us some of your most notable experiences from that show?
The one that really rocked my world was the trip to Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. As you know, I have a really strict rule on having the crew and cast not tell me where I'm going and being led to the location blindfolded. First of all, the place was enormous and there were so many layers of perceptions. It was really overwhelming, especially blindfolded and going in just without any context whatsoever. But it was also a place where I had a first. I'd never encountered a simultaneous residual haunting with the intelligent spirit tied to that residual haunting also in the location. That was extraordinary. It was also a really horrible, crushing haunting. It was the fellow who had been murdered in one of the upper rooms. He was tortured, hung repeatedly, harassed by other inmates. He was an inmate himself, and then had his head caved in as they jumped up and down on a bed. They put like the leg of the bed on his head. That whole thing, picking that up, getting both his experience as it used to be and also perceiving the spirit, the intelligent being who was kind of still stuck, unable to quite sort out what was going on with him. That one was intense.
Was he surprised by that? that spirit, that the residual energy was there too? Did that surprise the entity as well, or is that more common for them versus mediums and psychics?
I don't know. In his case, the person, and this was a fairly recent one, like I believe the person had died in the 80s. He was developmentally handicapped. And so he really wasn't very clear. And now there's a lot of beliefs about like what happens when we transition from life to death. And while it's true that like our physical maladies and ailments don't have to translate to the other side, and technically they go away, if we are really hung up on them, if we're really wound up in that previous experience, if we either can't let it go or if we are still working through the trauma connected to it, we can still experience it as a spirit. So the complication in his case was he hadn't really moved past who he used to be. So he was very confused, related more like a child than an adult, and was really difficult to get through to. He's also one of the first spirits where I'm really not a big fan of the whole like sending them into the light. I've got a number of ethical issues with that idea. But he was the first one where I was seriously considering, like, is there a way I can just kind of like knock this guy out and like get him to move past this? Because reliving that and then witnessing the reliving of it with like the event itself stamped on the space just seemed like a particular type of hell that this poor guy did not deserve.
So if a person like my mom, she had dementia and she passed with dementia several years ago. Now, if she stayed a ghost, the dementia could stay with her. But if she became a spirit and went on into the light, then the dementia should theoretically go away. Is that accurate?
I mean, the ghost spirit, the terms are much more fluid than that. Basically, if she dies with dementia and she has a lot of trauma, a lot of things wound up with that, she can't quite get past some of the experiences there. She carries those emotions with her. It may linger, but in most cases, I'd say like, easily 9 out of 10, all of the things that you were experiencing that were, your mental disabilities, your physical problems, like those slough away with the body. But there are rare cases where there's so much emotion and, like I said, psychological trauma wrapped up with the experiences that for a little while, at least after death, the spirit's still so connected to who they used to be that those pieces still, they still experience it until they realize that they don't have to.
One other question, if you don't mind on that. I also have a daughter who has autism. And so while I know she's brilliant in her thoughts and because I know how she writes and everything, obviously the communication barrier. So a person with autism, when they pass, would that autism fog lift? How would that communication happen? Or would you just be able to communicate where you couldn't before?
I think it might depend on the type of autism. I live with somebody who's an Aspie and have a number of friends who are high-functioning autists. And that gets into some really interesting, deep questions about, is autism in all cases a disability or like a medical problem, or is it simply that your brain, that you experience the world and you think differently? So I think it would depend on how much is that a part of the person's identity, as opposed to something that has gone wrong with their wiring or their internal chemicals? Is it a physiological problem, or is it the way that this person interfaces with reality, that's something that is natural and inherent to them? And I can't predict which of those that would be. I do say, in moving beyond from life to death, we gain perspective, or we at least have the opportunity to gain perspective on who we are, how we relate to our body, to the people around us, how we relate to our emotional experiences throughout our life. And we can have the quiet time to put those into better context and make decisions about those. And oftentimes more informed decisions, whereas, life is messy. Like, we get really wound up in what we're doing. There's all of this like hormonal and chemical stew going on in our brains and our bodies. There's a lot of things pulling our attention this way and that. And it's really hard to figure out, like, who am I underneath all of that? Who am I with it and who am I without it? So explorations of identity are a key part of how the dead process the previous life and decide whether or not to move on.
Well, that's great. I want to talk about your family upbringing, if you don't mind, because you had a very cool family that was open to paranormal experiences and encouraged you to talk about them. You had kind of different family members. You had an uncle who was into UFOs, an aunt that gave you a unique perspective. Do you mind talking about some of those family members and how they kind of affected you with your paranormal development growing up?
Yeah, actually, it's a colorful family. So I was raised by my grandmother, her younger brother, and her older sister. So that's Graham, Aunt Rita, and Uncle Jim. My mom was in the picture until I was in kindergarten. And my mom was a hippie art student who got shot at Kent State. So kind of a radical, very much a free spirit. We connected and became really good friends once I was an adult, but we were in very different stages prior to that. So my Graham, her brother and her sister, they were Irish American, they were Irish Catholic. And the thing about Irish Catholics is you can't take the mysticism and the fairies and all of the like weird, like second sight stuff out of that, even though they identified as Catholic. And so I was raised Catholic, but also we talked about second sight. We talked, Aunt Rita would tell stories about the black coach and black dogs and family banshees and all kinds of weird hauntings from the old country. Aunt Rita was interesting because she was a social worker. She had almost gotten her degree in psychiatry, but she quit in order to take care of their ailing mother. So from her, I got an interesting perspective, balancing experience along with analyzing how our brains work, how we experience things. I'm sure anybody who's paid attention when I do interviews, you can tell there's a pretty solid background in psychology for me as well. My grandmother was a little more mystical, and probably the best lesson I took away from my grandmother was anybody can be psychic after the fact. What you want to do when you have experiences is to record them, to make hard copies of them, and to analyze them rather than just like go around bragging that, oh, hey, I had a dream that this was going to happen and it happened. Like it wasn't about showing off. It was about learning and understanding and verifying. Now, Uncle Ray, who was an uncle by marriage, he was an Air Force man. He had been in the Vietnam War. I don't know how involved he was with Project Blue Book, but he mentioned it. I do know that the family needed to be like a full vetting by the FBI in order for him to marry into the family. He had really high security clearance, and there were some bits that were a little ooky spooky with that. He took me on UFO watches a couple of times. And I'm not going to lie, we saw some stuff. I don't know what to make of it. I know that this is probably going to sound weird as somebody who talks to dead people, but I'm not sure what I think about UFOs and aliens. Like, I believe that it would be completely ridiculous, an immense amount of hubris to assume that we are absolutely alone in the universe. But past that, like the idea that there are physical spaceships or physical aliens that visit here, I find the concept so unnerving. I'm not sure quite what to do about it.
A quick point, Michelle. One of the people I interviewed recently, a guy named Avi Loeb, he's a Harvard astrophysicist. Are you familiar? Have you heard about him at all? Or
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, so kind of the flyby Oumuamua,
Hmm.
and he actually wrote a book, and he's been on every podcast. He's been on like Joe Rogan and Lex Friedman and I was trying to get from him if he believed that people had been here already. He kind of like didn't want to talk about that. He wanted to talk about the science and how we have this capability now and that we need to look up at the stars and gather. Right now, we have all the science and the technology to really measure things, and we should focus on that rather than opening up old documents from like 70 years ago or whatever. But he was a really interesting guy. His takeaway was that he said, you know what? People spend so much time looking right in front of their face rather than up in the sky, which people used to do way back when, the ancients used to. And he talked about, there's a sense of modesty that we have when we look up in the universe, but there's also a sense of why play it safe? You're only here for a short term. Think out of the box. And he felt that science did not, they would do intellectual gymnastics with kind of parallel universes and string theory, things that you couldn't really prove, rather than taking a leap of faith on an interstellar object passing by the sun.
Mm-hmm.
He was an interesting guy and what he thought about science. So yeah. If you don't mind, one of the things about UFOs is, and I'm sure you're not a fan maybe of all the shows, when I watch some of the shows on TV on the Travel Channel, a big fan of a wide range of them, you'll always hear like, okay, they walk out and maybe they're on a land and, it's Indian burial ground and you have to leave an offering, or you're inside and you have to get a medium to get rid of this entity or a priest for this exorcist.
Mm.
But whenever it's an alien, they never have. It's like, we can't do anything about that. If you're visited by aliens, we don't have any paranormal thing that we can do. So you've experienced maybe some things that you said for UFOs. I wonder if you could share some of those with your paranormal abilities. Have you ever felt kind of a different type of being that was intelligent, that wasn't a ghost or a demon that you thought might be an alien?
Let me talk about the experiences with Uncle Ray first, because those were purely physical. I was what, 10, 11, 12, early teens for some of these. But it was like literally out looking at the stars in our backyard, out at Hinckley Reservation Lake. And the one that sticks out the most was there was something that was no bigger or brighter than most of the other stars in the sky. So it looked like it was way, 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 way up there. And when he drew my attention to it, it was moving, not like just a little bit, like it was tracing a very, very clear line. And this was just outside our house in Hinckley. And it moved from north to south and seemed to come down a little closer to us. It grew a little bit brighter, and then it just took off. It moved at a rapid pace and just diminished and disappeared and seemed to lift up. It was really bizarre trying to see it from the ground. And like I said, he was Air Force, so he was able to rattle off, like, this is what this craft looks like, this is what this craft looks like. This was back when we didn't have like 1,000,000,001 satellites in the sky. The only thing that I had at that point really was just like this sense of wonder, that kind of sense that you get when you stare up at the sky and realize that there could be 1 billion worlds around all of those different stars, and how many different people and how many different minds. Like, it's a very different quality than the psychic perceptions that I get. Whatever I was looking at, whether there was nothing to connect to psychically or just simply I was unable to, it felt like a purely physical experience. Now, in terms of investigations, there are so many different sorts of things out there, and it's hard to say what's what. I mean, I wish there was a Tobin's a field guide to spirits, like that would be great. But I've certainly encountered things that do not appear to be human, and I wouldn't necessarily classify them as demonic or elementals. They seemed from elsewhere, and I hesitate to give hard terms and hard definitions to things when I'm still trying to figure out, like, what is it that I'm dealing with. But there are certainly instances that I've interacted with things that seem like travelers, but not things that would have come in a saucer or a spaceship. They seem to be things that move between spaces in ways that I can't necessarily wrap my head around. Interdimensional, transdimensional, whatever you want to call them. So yes, I've definitely encountered things that are perceptible as spirits. They do not seem to have a physical form as we would understand it, and they seem to be intelligent, and they seem to be vaguely humanoid, but wholly not from around here.
Was there malintent with them? I know I don't want to lump them all together, but do they tend to be more inquisitive or curious, or is there, like demons? I know demons can be good and bad based on before Christianity and maybe in earlier times. Was their intent overall generally just curious, or was there some danger and harm that they wanted to do to?
In almost all cases, the overwhelming perception I got was curiosity. In at least one case that I'm thinking about, there was the sense that this thing was projecting a sort of human appearance, or at least a humanoid shape, and that was a conscious choice on its part to attempt to interact. That form even was a type of communication, that this was a choice on its part. There was a watchfulness. It felt more like it was something that was present to observe. And although it felt a little unnerving because the alienness definitely stood out, like the energy didn't feel like what I was accustomed to. It seemed like it was intelligent, but it was hard to predict like what its value system was, like what did it want. That was pretty hard to figure out, and just the not knowing can be a little unnerving. But it didn't feel mean or aggressive. It was just passing through and about as curious about the rest of us as we were about it.
You talked about, I know I took you off track a little bit. That's great though. I love the alien aspect of it. You talked about your mom, your Aunt Rita, and your uncle. Was there anyone else in your family that had an impact on you?
My mom, all of her sisters had some ability or another. So my mom's eldest sister told me ghost stories, and actually talked about telekinesis and would actually show off. I think they call them sliders now, those people who can kind of affect street lamps. And she didn't have that term for it, but we were out somewhere and she was like, hey, I can do this thing with my mind, and would knock stuff on and off pretty reliably, could turn off and on certain lights. So my family was pretty darn weird. Is really what you should probably take away from that. And the idea of, telepathy, of telekinesis, of perceiving spirits and communicating with them was just not weird at all. It was sort of presented as a normal part of life. And reincarnation was a part of it as well. It was something my mom talked with me about pretty early on. I don't know, I grew up in an age of wonder with a side of objective psychological inquiry to understand like how the human brain works and how the human brain can sometimes mislead our perceptions and lie to us, and why it's important to always step back from experiences and assess them because of that reason. So I think it uniquely suited me for paranormal investigation, although that was certainly not what I was planning to grow up to do. My goal initially was to just become a college professor. I was a National Merit Scholar, full ride scholarship, planned on just, going straight to the PhD, publishing some papers, and just being that quirky English professor that would tell you all of the naughty things that your 19th century British literature people were doing behind the scenes, because that always made it more interesting than just reading the poetry.
So did anyone ever try to stop you and say, no, don't be a paranormal, because you've done quite well, obviously. You've written all these amazing books. You're a para-celebrity. You're on TV. You're well-known. Beyond that, you have other skills as well, obviously, music and crafts and all that stuff. But did anyone ever try to stop you and say, no, go down the academic path. Don't go down the paranormal?
College was definitely a crossroads for me. And there was a lot of pressure to actually go. The first place I got pressured to go instead was, don't go into liberal arts and humanities. You've got a scientific mind. We would like to put you into this program. Please go into science. And I didn't have an interest in that, although I was offered some very juicy scholarships for that purpose. And I guess from that point forward, really, like, I've never responded well to people telling me what to do, to put it politely.
Yeah, it's good. Good for you.
There were certainly some people, especially in college and like early publishing, that expressed some like, oh, paranormal stuff again. Because, that was before it was remotely popular or even vaguely respectable. I mean, we're still at the tail end of the satanic panic. But I believed then, and I hold to it now, that it's a significant part of human experience. It's not bunk or hokum. It needs to be investigated with a little bit more analysis and authority than just, I don't know, it needs good minds. It needs solid inquiry. It needs an empirical approach. It needs people to delve into it.
It definitely needs more science because, I mean, I interviewed Brandon Alvarez from Ghost Hunter, and he's big on that. And ironically, Ave Loeb, the astrophysicist, he wanted to be a philosopher, and he ended up going into astrophysics, and now he feels like there was a connection there anyways. I noticed in listening to you on podcasts and following you online a little bit, you were an early reader, and I have two little girls who are just crazy readers. I mean, they read so much they had to get glasses. They destroy their eyes. And my mom was a librarian. And you had your first ghost experience at a library in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
You weren't sure it was a ghost until later on. Do you mind sharing that with us?
Yeah, it's a fun story. So I grew up in a little town called Hinckley.
Hinckley, what state is that?
Ohio.
Ohio. Okay, great. Oh, that's a great paranormal place anyways.
Yeah, no, the whole state is freaking weird.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Hinckley, to give you context, it's this tiny little town. Like the center of town is a crossroads. There's a beverage store, there's the town hall, there's a church, and there's the library. Only the library was just an old house that they turned into a library. I believe they bought it in 1975. Hinckley celebrates the return of turkey vultures around the Ides of March every year with pancakes and sausage. Like swallows to Capistrano, carrion birds come back to my small town and we celebrate with pancakes. So that gives you an idea of kind of like Hinckley's yardstick for normal.
Yeah.
This was before my final open heart surgery. So I know that I was probably 4 and no more than 4.5 because that happened the weekend after Star Wars came out. My mom took me to the library to get some more books because I was an early and voracious reader. I think partly inspired by the amount of time that I spent in the hospital, not being able to get out to do much. My mom knew the librarian, so she was like, yammering with the librarian, and there was, a little young reader's room, and they were still in the process of renovating the building to make it a library because, like I said, it had been a private home. It was a house that had been built in like the 1860s, maybe 1870s, on an older lot than that. So there was yellow tape in a couple of places that I was told very specifically not to go. Now, to go back to the fact that I've never been very good at listening to people when they tell me not to do something, that goes back very early. So the instant my mom's back was turned, of course, I needed to know why I wasn't allowed to go up these stairs and underneath the yellow tape. So I ducked under the tape and I go up the stairs. And, I was actually disappointed at first because it was just a carpeted hallway and it didn't look very interesting at all. There was a door that was slightly open and I could see sunlight through it. So I went poking in there. And again, super disappointing for 4-year-old me because it was mostly empty. Like there was a tarp on the ground, basically painting stuff. Like they were painting the room. So there wasn't much of anything in there. There were no people in there except one woman who was standing at the window. And I didn't notice her at first. Mostly I was just like, oh, nothing interesting up here. And then I turned and I see her at the window. And she was crystal clear to me. It's interesting because it's not like I was ever discouraged about spirits or seeing spirits. So it's not like I suppressed the ability to perceive them like this. I kind of grew out of it, though. I can get into that in a minute. But what I perceived was a woman standing at the window. She had dark hair that was all piled up on the top of her head. She had this dress that had like a high kind of tight collar and really big poofy sleeves, which I know in retrospect are called mutton chops or mutton leg sleeves. They got really tight toward her forearms. There were all these tiny little buttons down there and all these tiny buttons down the back of the dress. And to me, the dress looked kind of white with like blue embroidery, like little flowers on it. Oh. And 4-year-old me is standing there just basically trying to figure out how she buttons all the buttons. Go in a line from like just below her waist all the way up to the back of her neck. I am just baffled by the buttons. So I'm staring at her, trying to sort out the button issue. And she doesn't say anything. I know that she must be an intelligent spirit because she stops and she looks at me. She doesn't say anything. If I had known the word at the time, I would have said that the look she gave me was melancholy. She looked like not crying, but just sort of like longing. And she sort of like does this big exaggerated sigh and then looks back out the window. And I can't tell you if I heard any sound. And in retrospect, I'm not entirely certain that she was casting a shadow either. But I just fixate on the buttons. And this probably happens in the blink of an eye, really. At which point my mom misses me and she hollers up from downstairs, Mickey, where are you, Mickey? And I duck my head out the door and, get that guilty flush that only moms can inspire in us when we've been caught doing something that we shouldn't. And, holler back, coming, Mom! And, be right there. And in the time that it takes me to yell back to my mom and turn back into the room, the woman is gone. 4-year-old logic tells me that she shouldn't be in the room either, so she has found a hiding spot. There's nowhere to hide in the room, and as far as I know, I was standing in the only door going into the room, but that didn't pierce the logic of 4-year-old me. So I scurried out of the room and didn't think much about it until years later, where I started hearing that the library was haunted. And I was like, oh, well, what are people experiencing? And they described the lady in blue. I ended up doing some research on it in the 90s, and her name was Rebecca. She was the sister of the school teacher. She died an old maid at, I think, 28, but she was known for her seamstress work and her embroidery, which always struck me because most people perceived her in a blue dress. I perceived a dress that was white with blue flowers, but very painstakingly embroidered with this blue. And that always stood out as really interesting to me.
So that was a full body apparition. You didn't see through it. She was there as if I was standing in front of you, correct?
There was no point that 4-year-old me thought that was anything other than a regular human being in the room.
Was there ever any connection why she's looking out the window? You always hear ghost stories about looking out the window, lost her love, and waiting for him to come back. Was there any story connecting to that?
In doing research on her, it seems, she died single. There was no indication clearly of a lost love or anything, but it seemed like she was just a very sad and melancholy person. And by reports, the library made the most haunted list in the 90s and stuff.
Really?
Her father also seemed to hang around because it was an older gentleman who was usually seen in kind of a bowler cap. And the working theory locally was that he hung around to basically look after her until she was ready to move on, which I thought also was a sort of neat part of the story. I went and visited her grave. I couldn't find his, but I left her flowers and was just like, hey, hope things are looking up for you.
Yeah, that's great. When you go to a location, you're dropped off and you're blindfolded. Several places, near me, I'm in Massachusetts, the Conjuring House, and was it Harrisville or Burrisville, Rhode Island? That land, I've gone there a couple times in with a psychic, and they're as soon as they step out, they're on the ground. They're like, oh my God, it's like an electric charge, or the Hinsdale House or whatever. Do you go to a lot of places and the land around it is more haunted than the building itself? So as soon as you step out of the car, you're like, oh my God, this it's the land, not the building.
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes it's the place. I'd argue that that's the case with Hinckley. The place itself, there's just something about it, and something about that land, I don't know, makes things thinner, makes things, boosts hauntings, or makes things more inclined to hold residual hauntings. Whatever it is, there are certain places where the land itself seems to feed into clusters of hauntings in that location. There's numerous places I've been to, the most colorful being New Orleans, which isn't necessarily a terrible, bad experience. It's just something about New Orleans, and especially the French Quarter, just holds all of these things or amplifies them. So that space is just crawling with so many experiences. It's like when I'm down in the French Quarter, there's a certain quality at night where I'm never 100% certain if what I'm dealing with is, a person, somebody who's really into New Orleans nightlife, or, I could be talking to a spirit from the 1700s who appears to all intents and purposes simply because the place is so full of that type of energy, looks like a person to me. I grew out of perceiving spirits as if they were external physical people. I think for me, that was a matter of learning how to assess those perceptions and kind of a survival mechanism of being able to tell the difference between the living and the dead. So I didn't just go off and have a conversation with people that weren't perceptibly there to other folks. And yet there are still some exceptions. And New Orleans is one of those places, and certain locations that seem to, I don't know, for lack of a better term, boost the signal, will still have such an intense reaction that I will sometimes perceive them as if they were regular physical people and be taken a little bit off guard because I'm not used to that.
Is most of that residual energy, which is like a timestamp or something embedded into the land versus ghosts? And our residual energy, is that the majority of the hauntings that you run into? Or is it a good kind of combination between intelligent ghosts and residual energy?
I'd say the vast majority of hauntings are residual energy, a recording, a freeze frame, if you will, usually of intense emotional experiences or traumatic experiences. I think we notice when they're traumatic experiences because we're sort of assaulted by the perception, whereas I believe that very positive, delight and joy and wonder can leave an imprint, but we're less inclined to go, what's going on with that? Like if we walk into a room and we're always happy there, we're not going to question it. We're just going to enjoy being happy. Whereas someplace like Gettysburg, where so many people experience various echoes of what played out there. Gettysburg is usually the example that I give, any haunted battlefield really, for the argument that most hauntings are more about an echo in time, a memory ghost rather than intelligent spirits. Because what a lot of people experience there is a replay of the battle. And it defies logic, really, if you want to think about it. Not even all of the people there died. Like, you're not necessarily dealing with all of the soldiers who are perceived in something like Gettysburg, like a haunted battlefield. It doesn't make sense that each and every single soldier on the battlefield is an intelligent ghost tied to it. So what you're dealing with, what you're experiencing there is the memory of their experiences. You can have overlap where there are still some intelligent spirits that are in a location like that. I hadn't personally, until Trans-Allegheny, experienced a situation where there was a clear residual haunting that was replaying a specific event tied to a person who died, and also the intelligent remnant of that person in the same location. But I'm sure that it also happens in Gettysburg and a number of other haunted battlefields.
Yeah, it's kind of like an old record that the needle gets stuck in the same place and repeats the same little section over and over again.
Yeah.
I've heard before that you're not just an experiencer, you study the paranormal, and as such, you become an expert on primarily, maybe not primarily, but it sticks in my mind, demons and vampires based on some of your most notable books. How did you become drawn to these two separate entities, and how were you able to learn so much about them?
Okay, well, demons is much easier in terms of academic stuff. My degree is in comparative religious studies, and I went to a Jesuit Catholic college. I think one of the things that steered me toward demons was my freshman year. Dr. Joseph Kelly, who ended up being in charge of the religious studies department and was also somebody who mentored me on a couple of independent studies, he taught demonology at my college, and I ate that class up. He was the type of professor that I wanted to grow up to be, just this brilliant, leaping mind. Like, this is back when you're taking notes with your hand, and like you had to write so fast because he would go from talking about Mephistopheles to the art of H.R. Giger, and he'd ramble something off from the Book of Enoch and some biblical pseudepigrapha and like pull it all together, and all of that in like the space of 10 minutes. And that just ignited my interest, my curiosity. There were some interesting family stories about the meaning of my last name, Belanger, which is beautiful angel in French, which also steered me down the path of trying to understand some of the folklore around angels, demons, the idea that there were not just fallen angels, but angels that actually came down and married among humanity. And that was something that I have delved into at this point, going on 30 years. So the demons are easy. I love reading. I love actually reading biblical literature and pseudepigrapha and like all the old influences from the ancient Middle East. And that kind of hits my fascination with folklore and mythology and also anthropology, like why people believe what they believe. And that's led to things like the Dictionary of Demons. Vampires are a little more personal.
Can I actually just interject real quickly about the demons? Is that
Yeah.
okay?
Oh, yeah,
So,
please.
so in the demons, I don't even know if you remember it. There was an older YouTube video where you talked about that dark is in the eye of the beholder.
Mm.
And then you put it in context with what happened kind of with on the death of Socrates and with Moses.
Mhm.
Do you mind sharing that? Because really demons before, in the current context, they're bad, but they didn't have to be bad. They were just non-human before. Could you just add a little color to that for us?
Absolutely. So our word demon comes from the Greek word daemon, and we interface with the word demon based on sort of the mythology that's grown up about it within our culture, at which point it is a very Christian take. There are angels, there are demons. Demons are necessarily the scions of hell. They are after human souls. They're basically evil personified. But the word demon in Greek was more about a being that existed in this sort of hazy space between humans and the gods, a little bit closer to the Hindu idea of devas and asuras, which are sometimes presented as cognates for angels and demons, but it's not a one-for-one. And the best way to put demon, at least the Greek concept of demon, into context is that Socrates believed that he had a personal demon. He was not unique in this. Greek daemons were a little bit like guardian angels or spirit guides. People could have one of these beings looking out for them and looking after them and offering guidance throughout their life. And you could have a eudaimonis, a good demon, or you could have a kakodaimonis. And that's not necessarily a bad demon, but it's a demon of chaos, a being who was more likely to be kind of a trickster and would lead you astray, mostly for, I don't know if I can say that, for shins and giggles.
I have a beep sound effect. I've had to use it a couple times. That's okay. That's good.
I caught myself though. Anyway, so eudaimonis and kakodaimonis were the things. So good and so think more order versus chaos rather than good versus malevolent or evil. When Socrates was condemned to death for misleading the youth of Athens, there's a whole political thing that people can go read up about that. Socrates got the raw end of the deal, and he was condemned to drink hemlock in front of the assembly. And the day on which he was going to do this public execution, he notes that his daemon never spoke against what was going on. And from that, he took that death was not necessarily a bad thing because his personal daemon had never misled him and had always warned him if he was going to go down a path that was destructive. So understanding that in the ancient world, what people meant by demon or even angel is not the same as what we understand it to be now is a significant part of that academic background. If we go back even further, our idea of demons comes very much from the ancient Middle East and what we think of as the cradle of Western civilization. So Mesopotamia, so the Tigris, Euphrates River, all the way over there. And most of what we understand about possession and exorcism, demonic obsession, comes from their beliefs and their practices. But if you read what they meant by demons as well, many of the things that they were identifying as demons were actually gods, or were the children of gods, and were simply behaving in ways that either brought destruction or disease to humanity. So it was a matter of, well, without going too far into it, I think it's important to understand that the words we use change over time. And part of understanding the occult and the paranormal means understanding the anthropology and the folklore behind the words that we've chosen and what those words are supposed to represent, as well as the stories that have been told that not only are stories of experiencers, but are stories of media, stories of pop culture, because all of those things feed into our perception of these and what we mean when we start to use the terms. So demon's a really complicated one. And when I use it, it's not always in the sense of, Satan's little helpers that are out to eat people's souls, because it's so much more than that.
You always see on movies and in TV, you need to know the demon's name to cast it out. Is that true? Do you need to know the demon's name to cast it out?
Well, I don't know if I would strictly say that it is true, but it is definitely something that is consistent throughout folklore, particularly from Mesopotamia on. It was a significant part of the exorcism rituals that come down to us from Sumer and Babylon, where the names of these beings gave a person the power to compel and banish and bind them, as well as to summon them. And there is a rich vein of literature that comes down to us from that. Renaissance Europe, it's the Solomonic tradition and sort of the roots of ceremonial magic, like picks that up and makes a real big to-do of it, where it's not just a name, but each demon has a sigil and a metal and different astrological associations, and all of these are things that then give you basically the key to controlling them and either calling them up to ask them for favors or sending them away to banish and exorcise them. So the names are really important, especially in our Western mythological tradition. Now, is that a true fact? It's certainly a widespread one, and it's reflected in stories from the Bible all the way back.
Now, this might be a dumb question, but who names a demon? Is there a master demon that names them? Who actually gives them the name?
You know, there is no point in the literature that I have read that suggests that they got the name beyond, like, the name is their being, like it's what they came into existence with. And I think, okay, so I'm going to say I have not read any primary materials that say a demon got named this by an archdemon or whatever. Their names are simply presented as this is its name.
It's just kind of a Big Bang thing, right? There's no before. They come into existence and they have that name, basically. Okay.
Yeah, no, implied in that is that the name is its essence. And it's actually that's an incredibly insightful question, and I love it, because if you go back to Sumer and Babylon, what their name is the thing that they do. Mm. It's really important to understand that ancient demons, it's impossible to separate theology from medicine in the way that they looked at these things, because a lot of the ancient demons were literally diseases, were literally psychological problems. So the demon of tetanus, his name was tetanus, or the Greek or the Sumerian word for tetanus. And people who were possessed by that demon, who were affected by that demon, literally just had tetanus. So the way that they looked at the world, they had no idea of germs or germ theory. What they saw was someone whose body was just starting to lock up to the point where their back would bow and the back of their head would meet their heels in the worst part of this, where the progression of the tetanus disease. And so they named that tetanus. I'm not going to off the top of my head rattle off the Greek name for the tetanus demon, but just it's a translation for tetanus.
So a name is almost like a preordained fate for a demon, and you really can't change them. They are who they are, and you can't even kind of cure that or even send them into the light, can you, or what?
The idea is the name is what they are and what they do and the essential nature of them. And it's that essential nature is why having it is a talisman. It gives you power and gives you an idea of what their capabilities are. And so the general idea of demons, and this is both from like the folklore, the mythology, as well as I'd say modern widespread sentiment, is that they came into being, and you can't really kill them. You can banish them, you can send them away, you can bind them, but you cannot end them. What may be able to end them is perhaps a higher power than all of us. And for some reason, theologically, that higher power doesn't seem to want to end them.
So that's where we're going to end part one. On our next interview, part two, which will be a lot shorter, Michelle is going to talk about psychic vampires. It's a great episode, and I wanted to cut it here because I want to focus on that for the next one that we're going to do, the follow-up. Right now, we're just going to end with me asking Michelle on where you can get some of her great books, so stay tuned for just a few more minutes. Give me a quick soundbite of some of the books that you're best known for. Let's start with the Psychic Vampire Codex. Let's talk about that.
Okay, so the Psychic Vampire Codex was the book that I set out to publish first. There were a lot of other options, but because coming to understand what vampire meant for me and what that identity was and how integral it was to my perception of energy and my experience as a psychic being, I knew that there were other people out there who were going through the same journey and probably had the same questions. And there was no book. Like, it was the most frustrating thing, struggling in the dark as a teen and just angsting over this whole thing. So I wrote the Psychic Vampire Codex for other folks who were vampiric like me to understand, what is this ability? What do you do about it? What are the ethics behind it? How do you feed? What it's like when you're taking energy from a person, how to do that safely, how to do that in a way that actually enriches both parties. It is my vampire handbook.
The Dictionary of Demons. Did you recently update that from maybe a decade ago with some great new stuff?
Yeah. So the Dictionary of Demons came out in 2010, and that one I needed to update only because there's been so much good research and great academic stuff that's come out since then. At this point, it's like 500 pages of book. Like, it's a big, meaty tome. And probably another 200 demon names in it at minimum.
It's like the phone book of demons. If I ever get possessed, I'll pull that out and I'll be able to know. I'll go through the list and find who has me encumbered.
A regular who's who of hell.
Yeah.
It's a fun. It's also where I really got to like dig back into my academic background, and just they let me put in as many citations as I wanted. So.
Yeah, there's 3 other books real quickly I just want to cover. One is The Ghost Hunter's Survival Guide. Talk about that and who should get that.
The Ghost Hunter's Survival Guide is pretty much my book on psychic self-defense for folks who are psychic practitioners, for folks who take a more theological approach, as well as for folks who have more of a psychological approach to things. I try to speak to all of those experiences. I wrote that as an answer to when we were doing investigations for Paranormal State. Again and again and again, folks needed to figure out how to protect themselves, how to clear stuff, how to protect their kids, and how to assess whether or not a haunting was dangerous. And that is what that book is for.
Awesome. And then you did one based on your personal experiences called Haunted Experiences.
Yeah, Haunting Experiences was, I think, close to 15 years ago. It's technically now out of print, so I will be updating it, probably turning it into an audiobook.
And the last one is for people who aren't vampires, but they still need psychic energy, the Psychic Energy Codex.
There were so many energy workers and psychics who read the Psychic Vampire Codex and found useful stuff in it, but who were like, but this vampire thing is not my jam. So I wrote the Psychic Energy Codex as both a prequel and a companion to the Psychic Vampire Codex. If you are an energy worker, if you are trying to develop your psychic abilities and your perceptions, if you're trying to build objectivity and learn how to harness those abilities, that is your workbook. So it's basically my main psychic development tome.
Okay. And as for your TV, they probably could get Discovery Plus and see every episode of Paranormal State, I would imagine. And plus you're on Portals to Hell right now. And your website, I'm going to pronounce it like Belanger, even though it's Belanger, so it's easier. It's michellebelanger.com. MICHELLEBELANGER.com. And that's where they can find out all the cool stuff you have, get your books, and all the other great things that you do.
Yep. And easier to remember. I teach classes, and you can access pretty much all of my content and a huge community of other like-minded folks on my Patreon. And that one's super easy. Patreon.com/haunted.
I hope you do become a professor at some point, because I would love to take your class and be sitting in and have enjoyed this conversation and have you for a whole semester and hear all your stories. So thank you so much for sharing time with us tonight.
Thank you so much. This has been fun.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. then why not listen to another episode? Visit AfraidOfNothingPodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's AfraidOfNothingPodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout-out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.